Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Quincy Institute's webinar, where we'll be discussing with Branko Milanović his new book, The Great Global Transformation. My name is Marcus Stanley, and I'm the Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute. We are a transpartisan think tank in Washington, and we are working for a U.S. foreign policy that is less militarized and more focused on diplomacy and cooperation. Um, in our research and writing and through our advocacy, we promote ideas that move U.S. national security policy away from global domination and military adventurism and toward a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our country based on the interests of the American people. Today, I'm honored to welcome Branko Milanović, who is a presidential professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We're going to be discussing today his new book, The Great Global Transformation. Branko was the lead economist at the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years, which gave him really a front row seat to the transformation of the global economy that he discusses in this book. And he was and still is, also a senior fellow at the Luxembourg Income Study, which gives him really remarkable access to individual income data from people all over the world and really allows him to build an analytic and conceptual framework that addresses the really dramatic changes in the global economy and income distribution that have been happening over the last couple of decades. Branko, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be there.
Thank you. So this book, The Great Global Transformation, is really an incredibly rich and ambitious book. I found myself thinking that by the contemporary standards of maybe one or two big ideas per book, that a lot of the individual chapters in this book could have supported their own books. So I want to sort of ask you some questions that will let you unfold your thinking in a step-by-step way, because this is really a deep book and a hard book to summarize. So to start out, you say at one point, actually at a couple of points, that we are now living in one of the most momentous periods for the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. Can you unpack that and why you think that the last 30 or 40 years have been in many ways unprecedented, even given the spectacular changes since the Industrial Revolution?
Well, yes. Well, thank you very much for this question, Marcus. Let me try to actually, as you said, let me try to unpack a little bit what I do in the book and also to put the overall framework. The overall framework to which you already hinted is to look at the change in the world at two levels or two dimensions, if you will. At one level, we have the rise of China and more broadly the rise of Asia that changes totally geopolitical situation in the world and changes the economic allocation of the economic activity across the world. This is the topic of country versus country in some sense, which of course leads to the geopolitical competition between the US and China. But that also has an impact on individual incomes. And that's where this greatest reshuffle since the Industrial Revolution comes in. In other words, the rise of Asian countries, and China, of course, is the most important, but we are also talking about India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. Their incomes have risen in relative terms faster than the incomes of the rich countries. That has produced what I call the greatest reshuffling of individual income positions, in the sense that some Chinese or Vietnamese or Indian people have really gone and overtaken the lower parts of the Western countries' income distributions. To be very clear, take the lower part of the Italian income distribution, lots of people there are now poorer than middle-class people in China. And that, in my opinion, has been one of the factors that fed the political turbulence in the rich countries. So this is basically the story of the book, is actually trying to combine the developments at the level of the world and the countries with the developments at the level of individuals and political developments within the countries.
Thank you. And just noting to the folks listening, we are through the first 30 to 40 minutes here. I'm going to ask questions to Branko to try to draw out the themes in the book, and then we will be taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to those in the second half of the discussion. So Branko, as you sort of already were getting at there, one of the most original things about this book, I think, are these deep connections you make between changes in the global income distribution and the global economy, changes in domestic politics in all the major great powers, and changes in the global order, the increasing tensions between China, the United States, Russia. And at one point, you draw a parallel between Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin. And you say that all three of these leaders are in a certain way engaged in the same kind of political project. And that's really surprising to hear, given that they're incredibly different people. I mean, one is a reality TV host and a casino magnate in a capitalist country. Putin is a minor KGB agent who came out of the chaos of the collapse of Soviet communism. And then we have a princeling in the post-Mao Chinese Communist Party. So can you explain what you meant by that and what the nature of that political project is?
What I meant is the following. There is, I think, very little doubt, and I think everybody would agree that basically we are really at the end of the period of neoliberal globalization. Then the question becomes, like, first, what is going to be next? And that's actually it's in the subtitle of the book, what I call national market liberalism. But I will explain that later in maybe another question. But I started looking, of course, at the reaction, or I can call it counter-revolutionaries, that is the people who are leading this change. And I use the change in an entirely neutral way. I use revolution, counter-revolution likewise in a neutral way. So I don't want to have people ascribe, value judgments to that. And what I think is observable then is that you see all the three persons that you mentioned, actually Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, as reacting to some of the excesses of neoliberal globalization and also to the intellectual domination which went with it over the period from 1990 to like approximately 2016. And what are the similarities? They are also being driven not only by their own sort of persona, but by the popular sentiments in the countries, or actually some sentiment in the countries. And that's where I look at the three of them. And you can say, of course, with Trump, we know that quite well. It's a reaction against bi-coastal elites, liberalism, intellectual domination of the liberal ideology. But when you look at Xi Jinping, it's a reaction against the power of the rich people who have gradually insinuated themselves within the bodies of the party under the theory of the three represents, which was under Hu Jintao. And then he's reacting against them and reinforcing the power of the Communist Party of China. And Putin is also was reacting certainly against Yeltsin's oligarchs, and essentially was, of course, reinforcing the so-called the vertical of power and the role of the intelligence services. So in all three cases, they are, of course, very different individuals, and the forces that are supporting them are different. But I think the reaction against neoliberal globalization is something that actually unifies them ideologically to some extent.
Yeah, and I just noting for the people listening, there's some incredible internal data about China in this book that Branko has access to that really takes the cover off what's going on internally in China. And in particular, you have some amazing data on the anti-corruption drive that Xi Jinping engages in when he gets to power, where literally millions of people connected to the party are prosecuted in some sense for corruption, which has to do with these connections to global capitalism. And just recommend the book to people to get. You don't see that kind of data or detail in a lot of books now. So it's interesting. You talk about the intellectual domination of neoliberalism, and from the neoliberal perspective, like a lot of times, all three of these guys, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Trump, are just portrayed as authoritarians, and that's what they have in common: their personal power. And your analysis has them reacting to another kind of elite, to another kind of power, uh, this class of international wealth that emerges from globalization. And you seem to feel that this framework of democracy versus authoritarianism is in many ways limited and obsolete and tied to this previous neoliberal period. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I do think actually that if we use the framework, which is really a facile framework, authoritarians versus democratic-minded people and so on, we really lack, or we are unable to see the social and political forces that are sustaining the sort of reaction against neoliberal globalization. So, and that's why I think that there is the sort of, as I was explaining before, some sort of unity, not in purpose, because the three individuals and the three countries actually are not in any way united against something else. It's just they're within themselves united in promoting a new elite. And if you look at Trump is promoting a new elite. That elite is not the old elite, even at the top. And I think actually people who support him, who benefit from him, are a very interesting amalgam to some extent of people who have been left out of globalization and very rich entrepreneurs. If you look at who is supporting, I was saying before, Xi Jinping, it's really the party bureaucracy that felt essentially left out when the rich capitalists came to become much more important and to some extent trying to hijack the Communist Party. And in the case of Russia, it's really the country that is basically being run by the security services. So that's where the support comes. And if I may say just one more thing about China, because you mentioned that. The data that I had with two Chinese co-authors shows extremely rapid change in the Chinese elite, defined as the richest 5% of people. They depended mostly on state incomes, on state-owned enterprises, party, and so on, in 1988. But by 2018 and 2023, they are actually essentially depending on private sector incomes. So it is in reaction to that dramatic change at the top that drove then Xi Jinping from 2012, when he came to power, to actually push back against.
Yeah, this Chinese data, China often gets portrayed as a monolith in the West, with just this thing, the Chinese Communist Party driving it. And this book really takes apart that you have the emerge that China starts with the income elite being sort of people who are very directly part of government, and then it moves to a situation where capitalists emerge as a major part of that elite, and then there's then a movement back where the capitalist elite more recently are tied to the party. So it's really nuanced. And also, just responding to something that you said about how this framework of democracy versus authoritarianism sort of doesn't take into account the underlying social and economic forces that are driving things. I think one big thing we see in the US discourse is this intense personalization of everything. So Putin is like a really mean guy, and that's the essence of Putin. He's a Hitler figure, or Trump is a nut that emerges out of nowhere. But instead, what you try to do here is show the forces underlying these people, which I think is very valuable. So one thing that you point to with all three nations is that they draw on nationalist forces to push back against this globalized new economic elite. And there's sort of an analysis here of the rise of nationalism as a political response to the income shifts that come from globalization. And at one point, you comment that our situation is in some ways similar to the situation that prevailed before World War I. Now, if you're someone like me, and I think that World War I was the single most disastrous event in the history of Western civilization, because it led to World War II, led to the Cold War, that's a pretty scary thing to say. So what kind of parallels do you see to that situation and why?
Let me just say first that when you mentioned the underlying forces, I do absolutely emphasize the, how should I say, the support, the social support and ideological change that is being represented by, again, Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin. And I think it is very wrong, and actually, as I said already, facile, to just assume that individuals come like from the sky and they somehow change the situation. Indeed, the role of the individual is important, but what the underlying conditions were such that such individuals have been able to come to power and follow the policies that we were just describing. It is not random that somebody gets 77 million votes. It just doesn't happen like just you show up and you get 77 million votes. Likewise, you don't have the support in China and get the third term, which was actually originally anti-constitutional, without having some support. And likewise, in the case of Putin, who is now prosecuting almost 4 years of war without a very serious opposition domestically. So that's what I wanted to say. And I totally disagree with people who talk about so-called autocracy Inc., because they do not see that actually, while they are all reacting against the elites brought up by neoliberal globalization, they among themselves are not really united. They are all nationalists, and nationalism by itself cannot be international and global. So if you put them all three in the room and the three countries, they are going to fight among themselves because they do not have an internationalist framework. And that's what actually, to go back specifically to your question, that's where I see the danger, and there is similarities to World War I in two senses. First, the rise of nationalism that we just talked about, and secondly, the possibility of some triggers to actually bring the reaction that no one of the participants really wants to have, but they're actually driven, as it was in the case of World War I, driven by their own interest, short-term interest, to a catastrophe. So that was, I think, a similarity. And the third one is actually that, as you know, the World War I took place in midst of large globalization of trade and capital flows, where people were writing for years before World War I that would be a totally self-destruction if there was a war. So that was really kind of for economists, that was kind of how should I say, a conundrum. You have this interdependence, and everybody knows that you cannot actually go to war because you're all going to lose, and you still do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's and we're in terms of the parallels, we are in this situation now where we've had this incredible era of globalization where there's profound trade networks linking the US and China, but if there's a war over Taiwan or a blockade of Taiwan by China, that is going to disintegrate overnight. And just getting to what you say about this contradiction between trade and interdependence and war, you devote a whole chapter of the book to the connection between international trade and war and conflict, which I think is so critical and so understudied right now. And some thinkers have seen economic exchange as conducive to peace, but you also draw out these other traditions that question this. So what implications do you think the combination of interdependence and trade wars we have today have for world peace?
I draw, of course, on writing, starting with famous, of course, Montesquieu and so-called le doux commerce, like sweet trade, which actually, as Montesquieu wrote, would make manners and behavior of people more gentle because they would get engaged in trade and relationship with each other, and consequently their own interests would be best served by pleasing or looking to be pleasing the other side. But I also mentioned, and I think it's really very overlooked, the view of Adam Smith on that. And Adam Smith, like in many things, is a realistic thinker. And for example, on that particular issue, I found that part where he discusses the relationship between trade and conflict extremely interesting. So his point is the following. He says trade would lead to, I'm simplifying in today's terms, to convergence in incomes. So the nations that trade would become more similar in terms of income and technological development. Technological development, a similarity of technological development implies similarity of power, military power. And similarity of military power implies balance of power, which would keep peace. So you see in Adam Smith a fairly complex and very nuanced view. For not that the trade, like in Montesquieu, simply means that actually I'm being a nicer guy to you. It's actually trade brings us, like in the case of the US and, for example, China, to more similar technological development. And because we are afraid of each other, little bit like mutual assured destruction theory and balance of power, we would actually become more peaceful. So it's a very interesting view that I think Adam Smith has more, as I was saying before, more complex. And finally, then I look at the essentially neo-Marxist theories, which come with John Hobson first, then continue with Rosa Luxemburg, and then go to Lenin, which sees the competition for foreign land, basically, for the control of raw materials, resources, ability to dump your production in different places, leads to the mutual competition between great powers and to the war.
Yeah. And that last bit, which is not just among neo-Marxists, but it's also with Schumpeter, who
Yes.
is a very conservative thinker. But what unites Schumpeter and the Marxists is they see monopoly power as really important, whether you have on something. And I was just thinking about this critical minerals stuff all through that, which is like the hot issue in Washington now that and should be because China just threatened to cut off critical minerals as part of the trade conflict with the US. And there's very literally in Washington now this drive to go around the world and secure critical minerals resources, which very much, would seem to be conducive to conflict and brings to mind some of these discussions of imperialism from 100 years ago. So I want to ask about this. You posit this system of national market liberalism that will emerge from the rise of nationalism that will preserve a lot of the neoliberal market order domestically, because all these countries in their own way, the United States, China, Russia, I think all understand that the market is really important for national growth in some way. So there'll be an attempt to preserve this domestically, but then treats international economic policy in a more nationalist and exclusionary way through these trade wars and so on. And I'm curious both about your view on that and also whether this is really possible, whether it's really possible to combine liberal openness at home and exclusionary nationalism abroad. Because once you define the key industrial sectors of the economy as critical to national security and tied to international conflict, then they become a space for more government control and exercise of authoritarianism. So anyway, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with that, but let me just explain first the idea, as you actually did already, but let me just reinforce that. the idea of what I called the national market liberalism, and why I call it national market liberalism. And to see that, not imagine, but let's take liberalism in its sort of more abstract sense and divide it into two parts. One is the domestic part, where actually let's go to think of neoliberal policies, which are the usual mix of lower tax rates, greater deregulation, importance of the profit principle, and so on. And then international sort of pandan of that is free trade, flexible exchange rates, low tariffs, and so forth. So that part, and I think in particular about the United States and Trump now, I think that part really is being replaced very clearly, even before Trump, actually under Biden as well, but it started with Trump 1, is being replaced by neo-mercantilist or mercantilist policies. So the international part of liberal sort of thinking is being now replaced with mercantilist foreign policies. Domestically, if you take liberalism and divide it into economic and the social sphere, even in the social sphere, we see now in the United States actually a pushback against that. So which part remains, which area remains actually really very neoliberal is that one, which is economics, where actually we have a reduction in tariff rates, and in tax rates, where we have further deregulation of the economy and so forth. Now, that's where your question comes in. Is this sustainable given the needs for sort of security, which would then lead to the sort of recreation or reinforcement of that military-industrial complex that we have seen in the past? And I do agree with you that we have there sort of a contradictory movements where we see much greater role, or actually not much greater, but somewhat greater role of the state in critical industries, or actually the state pushing the private enterprise to do certain things that maybe the private enterprise would not do by itself. So there is a contradiction there. And going back to the issue of the minerals and the competition, I mentioned that in a small footnote, but it's, I think, very interesting. If you look at the situation prior to World War I, the competition was in those cases between Germany, UK, and France especially. And there is a very nice movie and a book called Pascalis Island, which is almost like carbon, well, today is like carbon copy of the past. Essentially, you have English and German engineers fighting in the Ottoman Empire in order to actually control a place where the minerals are. And that's exactly what is happening today in Africa. So it's really, I would actually suggest to people to watch that movie. It's called Pascalis Island. It's, the book is by Barry Unsworth. And it's really worthwhile actually seeing how the situation is very similar to the way that it was more than 100 years ago.
So see, when you tune into a Quincy Book Talk, you get movie recommendations too. So we're full service here at the Quincy Institute. Okay, I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then we're going to turn to the questions from the audience. There are some very good ones here. So toward the conclusion of the book, you sort of look toward the future and what may be happening in the future to the international order, and you give a really interesting analysis of China and Russia, and whether they can, in any sense, be sort of reabsorbed into something that looks like the previous Western liberal order that the US led. So you ask, is it possible for China to evolve into a liberal capitalist democracy? And you also ask about the Russia-Ukraine war and its implications. So can you summarize some of those thoughts about the possibilities for these great powers in the future?
I will be very brief on that. Let's start with China. I think it's absolutely sort of self-serving and unrealistic to think that the issue between China and the US is the product of the difference in political systems and the basis of the legitimacy of the two nations. If you have a hierarchical order, which the US sort of definitely chairs, if you will, or controls, you have a problem that big powers that actually believe themselves to be deserving the top role are very hard to integrate in a hierarchical order. So if China were to become democratic tomorrow, it's very hard to integrate within the US-led order, because China would expect to be basically co-hegemon. the US is not going to agree to have a co-hegemon, and then consequently, really, you cannot integrate. And I think that was a problem even with Russia originally, inability after the Cold War to give Russia a position that Russia believed that it deserved. So I think it was really at the origin of the issue. And then I've got to look at possible evolutions of China. One sort of interesting evolution is that we might have actually CPC, Communist Party of China, sort of becoming more similar to Kuomintang in terms of its own nationalism and state-induced development, and especially, which I think goes historically in China, the separation between government power and wealth of people. So in other words, not letting the rich people rule the country. And that really does not depend on whether the sort of current ideological situation would remain or not. I think it's really independent. China, as such, really cannot be anything else by a co-hegemon, and the issue is actually whether the US would agree to that, and I doubt.
Yeah, this inability or unwillingness of the US to accept a co-hegemon or to accept a more cooperative world order where we're not number one. When we talk about that at Quincy, we talk about that in terms of the insistence on US primacy. And really, one of the things that's basic to Quincy's approach is questioning under what circumstances that demand for US primacy is really in the interests of the American people and ordinary Americans. And if there's one area where I disagreed a little with the analysis in your book, it's that you do seem to ascribe a lot of the emergent conflict between the US and China to domestic political forces where Trump supporters, for example, feel that China is behind their economic disadvantage and dispossession, whereas I would say a lot of that conflict, that's part of it, but a lot of that conflict comes from elites in Washington, D.C., for just the reason that you said, that China, there can only be one at the top of the world order, and that comes from an elite minority in Washington, I think, that's very concerned to preserve that position.
Maybe I was a victim a little bit of and many people know me from from those writings, the so-called elephant chart. And for those who might not be familiar, the elephant chart essentially looks at the gains worldwide and the gains in real incomes during the high globalization period from 1988 to 2018. And actually what it finds is that the group essential that was relatively highly placed in the global economic distribution, group of people who were lower parts of the distributions in the US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, these groups have not really seen much of a rise of their income, whereas the top 1% globally and nationally has actually done very well up to 2000, basically 2008. And also the middle of the global income distribution, where China has done very well. So then it becomes sort of clear that it seems to me, you have two options. One option is that you go anti-globalization, which basically Trump is doing, and the other option, you go to for the national income redistribution from the rich to the middle class. And that's maybe, in some sense, I was sort of a victim of that point of view, where I saw the dissatisfaction of the people who were left out, who actually had a growth rate of less than 1% per year for 30 years, to be behind that reaction against China.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. But I did want to pop in one audience question here because it's so directly relevant to what you just said and so central to the book. One of the audience questions was, many Americans fear becoming downwardly mobile and appear to blame the elites. And if people resist change, they'll be left behind. Will the same thing happen in terms of downward mobility and blaming the elites in China and Russia? That's really the heart of the book, that you really trace in this book that downward mobility and the way that many Americans became left behind, and the way this created a reaction against elites in the United States. And you also say, I think you trace how this already did happen in China and Russia in certain ways, that inequality was also increasing in China, it was also increasing in Russia, and that also created a reaction against these new capitalist elites. And Xi Jinping and Putin, their power has a lot to do with that. Um, so that I thought that it was cool how that question just nailed the main idea of the book in many ways.
No, I totally agree. This is not anything new that I'm saying, that the general, not only perception, but even empirical data for the United States show that there was a significant group of people, various people, who felt that they were left out of the gains produced by globalization over 30 years. Certainly, globalization was not sold to them by telling them, look, you guys will not have almost any growth in real income. The median person in the US income distribution, as I was saying before, had an increase of less than 1% per year. So they were, you can call them malcontents, and that was not new. But what I also chart is that I show how their position globally has deteriorated. In other words, because of the rise of China and the rest of Asia, their global position has gone down. Now, that's not true for the higher part of the US income distribution, or rich countries' income distributions, because the China effect has not gone all the way to the top. But certainly the China effect has been sort of clear at the lower parts. And I mentioned before Italy, because since Italy has not grown in 25 years, that effect is even stronger. So people have actually lost 10 percentage points in the sort of global income ranking.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to some great audience questions we have here. And that's just that there's sort of this fascinating kind of philosophical sort of coda at the end of the book, where you make two observations that to me really draw together a lot of the deeper things in the book. One is that you say that capitalism develops both horizontally and vertically. And the other observation is you say that there are three deep driving forces in our time that are related. And one is the nature of property under capitalism, the other is human greed, and the third is nationalism. So do you want to, we could talk for another hour about those observations, but do you want to say anything about those?
I will be quite brief. Actually, people honestly should read. This is 4 pages at the very end. So it is something that one can read in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. So I'm not going to summarize it. It's also hard to summarize. But I would like extension of capitalism, vertical and horizontal. I think it's easy to explain. You know, you can call it horizontal, or the expansion over areas, or including new countries into the world capitalist system. That was something that has been discussed for more than 100 years. But what is interesting with the new technological developments is the ability to create new goods and services out of activities that were never commercialized. And this is something that we see every day. You know, Airbnb didn't exist because I had my apartment, and my apartment could not be commercialized. Now it becomes a hotel. I had my car, and I suddenly commercialize my car, it becomes a Lyft. Or then I actually don't cook anymore. I commercialize that activity. I commercialize taking my dog for a walk. So the number of activities that have existed in the past, and they were done generally within the family, and they were not part of the capitalist commodification, has now really massively increased. And I think with the internet and ability for us to communicate, it is actually going further and further. So this is what I wanted to say. There is a very significant expansion in what is called commodification or commercialization of activities. And this is a new phenomenon because technologically it didn't exist. And of course, it has linked also to this kind of gig economy and people doing 5 jobs at the same time, because again, it really makes it possible for them to do so. And that was not the case in the past.
Okay, so let me turn belatedly to the audience questions here. I really focused on, because we have limited time, on just Putin, U.S., China, and Russia. But one of the listeners asked whether Modi would fall in the same camp of leaders and whether there are some of the same driving forces in his rise as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do discuss India in terms of income distribution and the rise of India, which is really quite significant because Indian growth rates have really increased from the 1990s, and India, as we all know now, is the most populous country in the world, and it's actually really another great power. But it's a good question. I do not. I mean, there are clearly similarities between the view of the world that Modi shares with Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping, that nationalistic view. But it's a very good question. I really don't want to discuss Modi in the book. Maybe that's one of the omissions. Maybe in the second edition, I might add that. But it is true that there is certainly an ideological, how should I say, proximity or familiarity between the four of them.
So another question asked, the question is pretty short, but I think it's very interesting. Can you address the global 100 corporate shaping of economic policy worldwide? And I think that's actually a really deep question because you might have assumed coming out of the neoliberal order that corporations would be driving economic policy and the changes in the global economic order. But I would say we've actually seen nation states uh, becoming much more important than you might have initially thought. But of course, there is this role for corporations. So what do you think is the balance there?
Of course, the book really talks mostly about nations, and of course, as you mentioned before, the rise of nationalism, which nationalism is inherently linked to the state because it's the state that projects nationalism. It's much more difficult for a global corporation to use nationalism simply because the global corporation has people from all over the world and actually has interests that are actually dispersed around the world. And I do think now, looking backwards, I do think that maybe in the 70s and 80s and so forth, there was an exaggerated, even the 90s, exaggerated role that was ascribed to corporations. And we have seen now, and we see it with Trump now, really kind of the state, the government strikes back. It's actually, you then realize that when you have really head-to-head conflict, it's the government that is stronger because the government has ultimately the monopoly of power, and that matters. And maybe what we see now, and this is of course guesswork a little bit, we see the large corporations working through the government in order to sort of gain, to promote their own interests. But the state, the government has been really written off way too early.
Yeah, and I think you saw this under Biden as well, that when there was this move toward, I mean, it started in the first Trump, but Biden intensified it, this move toward export controls, this blockade of chips from China. You had a lot of corporations making a lot of profits from China, but they really did not resist this development politically. And I think it was revealed that the state was more powerful, both because corporations needed the state and also because it's very easy for the state to make the public turn against corporations when it makes a national interest claim and corporations seen as making a claim about their own profits. I want to be sure to get to this question because it's a question I had actually meant to ask you in email after the event, but it was, could you please repeat the name of the movie and also the book that it is based on?
The movie and the book are called Pascalis Island, and the author is Barry Unsworth. I'm almost sure, but I think it's Unsworth. But Pascalis Island is definitely the title of the book and of the movie.
Thank you.
Ben Kingsley is in the movie, by the way. Ben Kingsley. Okay, sorry.
So do varying comparative advantages as an economist, I'm sure you like that, factor into the strength of the respective three countries we've been discussing? Uh, and where are they able to influence growth in their respective sectors of dominance globally? That's an interesting question because there's the Ricardian theories of natural comparative advantages, but then there's also, I think, driving a lot of economic competition now, this theory of sort of monopolistic competition where you determine your advantages if you build up, your industrial base in certain areas.
That's a very important, but it's really a very interesting question. But let me reformulate it slightly when we talk about comparative advantage and the rise of China. I think, what limits the external political and economic power, well, not economic, but actually ideological and political power of China is the following, in my opinion. It is in an ability to summarize the Chinese experience in a way that can be applied directly in other countries that would like to follow China and to grow. What I want to say is that whatever you think of the Washington Consensus, it was a succinct sort of summary of what was believed by neoliberal globalization or globalizers that are the rules to follow. And if somebody sort of disembarks in Tanzania tomorrow, he or she comes with his 10 rules. You might agree with some, you disagree, but they are clear. Mm-hmm. The problem with China, China basically created its own comparative advantage and followed the policies that actually nobody thought feasible 30 years ago. But it cannot summarize it, in my opinion, well. I've talked to many Chinese about that as well, because they were really the result of in specific conditions of China and specific developments. And of course, we all know that the single party rule, ability to decentralize decision making, growth of the new capitalist sector, but supported by the state. But really, it is not easy to summarize in the rules that a Chinese, for example, economist who goes to Tanzania tomorrow can tell the government to do. And that, in my opinion, limits the Chinese projection of ideological power.
Yeah. So this next question, this gets to a whole, I'm just going to repeat that this is an incredibly rich book. It's under 200 pages, but it just deals with so much. And I will say, I will say it is dense in certain ways, but it really is so rewarding to read. But this question gets into a whole other aspect of the book that I haven't asked so much about because of time limitations. But the question is, how does the BRICS alliance compare to the G7 for influencing the world economic regime? And you really talk a lot about not just the BRICS, but the whole history of international economic multipolar organization and how it's changed and shifted over the years. So could you go into that some with relationship to the BRICS and the G7?
Yeah, there is one section where I actually try to, how should I say, to look at how the world was perceived over the last 40 years, dominantly perceived. And to make it very simple, what I want to say, that the world was perceived before the end of the Cold War in a very sort of trilateral way. You had the first world composed of capitalist countries that were rich. You had the second world of socialist countries that were sort of middle income developed at the middle income level. And then you had the third world of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And then that classification changed with the so-called end of history, where basically we went into political classification of the entire world was or could become or was aiming to become capitalist and liberal. And then there were, of course, some islands that were left out as authoritarian, and there were actually countries, including China, that were sort of maybe potentially could become liberal and capitalist. So I go over that classification. And of course, BRICS is actually much more recent. I see the BRICS as basically as a global South, but I don't see the unity of purpose, and I don't think that one can actually ascribe to them a certain unity of purpose or policy. Now there are actually, I think, 10 or 12 countries that are members of BRICS, and I see them as essentially the countries that were a little bit scared of being drawn into the what I call the global NATO system. So in order not to be into the global NATO system that especially Biden was promoting, you then just basically escaped into BRICS. But escaping into BRICS really means not very much, because that's not a group that has its own policy. Of course, they meet, there are certain things that they try to do, but overall, I think it's very modest. There are big differences between, for example, even culturally, historically, between, you take South Africa, Brazil, and China.
Yeah.
It's not, there is no unity of purpose in the same sense that, for example, US and France and Germany have.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny that sometimes in DC you get this paranoia around BRICS as as an anti-US alliance. Um, and I think that's greatly exaggerated for the reasons that you say. It's really not an alliance. It's almost a none of the above group, more than a unified group. So, next question, a really important one, I think. Is there a structure of global growth that can accommodate high growth rates in all of the great powers, resolving the zero-sum situation we find ourselves in? And the person asking it goes on to refer to this sort of idea of a global Green New Deal, green industrialization. I personally am a little bit skeptical of that for various reasons, but you can imagine, like, do we need some kind of, or could there be some kind of globally coordinated Keynesianism that creates harmonized high growth rates around the world? And what effects would that have on international conflict?
I wish that I would say, yes, it is possible, but to be quite honest, I don't think it is possible in today's climate. And not the climate change, but I mean climate, political climate. And going back to what we were talking about, and I think it is really difficult to even imagine, given that we have this significant increase in rise of nationalism, and that rise, as we were saying before, is really driven by objective domestic forces, to use very Marxist jargon. So they are not forces that have been invented, they are actually domestic forces that are real. And in such condition, to negotiate a sort of a redistribution of economic activity or some kind of a generalized coordination, I just see it as a totally, really absolutely unlikely and impossible. And that doesn't mean that actually that I don't believe that people who are arguing in favor of that, I believe they're very well meaning and they're very sort of people who try to solve these dilemmas that we have today. But do I see the world today moving towards that? Honestly, I just don't see it at all. And we have seen how the whole thing with COP in Brazil now has become downgraded very significantly to what it was 20 years ago. Not that it was actually very much real even 20 years ago, but at least there was on paper some agreement. Nowadays, even that does not exist.
So, yeah, it's very tempting to look to a new multilateralism, a new sort of multilateral solution to some of the problems that we have now. But I think one thing that kind of drives your book a little bit is the belief that the return to nationalism emerges from these sort of deep structural things. So it's hard to just kind of wish it away for a new era of cooperation. Um, Now, presumably, I think, one doesn't want World War I to break out again. I mean, this would be a disaster that would dwarf in a nuclear world even the original World War I. So we do have to try to be creative to figure out how to navigate this era of nationalism without conflict breaking out. But at the same time, we have to realize how deep the roots go.
I don't agree, Marcus. It's actually, I would say that, in my opinion, what would be very desirable development would be essentially the big powers getting together as they did in Bretton Woods in 1944. Because if you look at Bretton Woods, there are basically three powers there: US, UK, and USSR. USSR decided to basically not get engaged in Bretton Woods, and it became essentially the job of the US and the Great Britain or UK to do it. I think if we could bring all the big powers that we talked about today together, that would be a huge step forward. The problem that I see is not only the structural, it was a major problem, structural nationalism which exists, it also the sort of political rejection among many influential people of big power sitting together and deciding about the world. And once you have 200 countries, the whole thing becomes extremely watered down, and there is really, that's why we didn't have a single institution, practically no single institution after the end of the Cold War that was created. And I think it's very difficult now to imagine new institutions being created, because there is also a popular rejection, like we don't want to have another, Vienna Congress. We don't have to have another Paris Conference on Peace. We don't want great powers just to sit together like Yalta and decide. But in real world, that's what really should happen. I mean, if we want to avoid the war.
That's actually really that's very sharp, because what you're saying is that in some ways the rise of multipolarity and efforts at multilateralism that are too inclusive and that try to comprehensively include the global South can actually work against an effective form of international cooperation, which is going to emphasize a few great powers.
Yeah, I think so. And I was in Bretton Woods the only time in my life. I was there at the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods agreements. So that was at 2024. And when you read more about the Bretton Woods, they generally tell you, okay, there were 44 countries there, I think. But when you actually sort of break this down, what you very quickly realize, first, there was practically no country from Europe that had a government that controlled its own territory at that time. You had governments in exile that came from England, and you have lots of Europe that was allied with Nazi Germany, like Italy, Finland, Croatia, Slovakia, Hungary, that were not invited. And essentially, then you had the British dominions, or countries where the Britain ruled, like Egypt, India, that were included. So you really end up with three great powers. And I think that's something that today's public opinion would essentially tend to reject. And I think it is wrong to reject, because that's the real world. Maybe today you might need more than three, maybe you need seven, but that's actually, if you want to push multilateralism forward, you really have to have big guys agree to that.
Yeah, we're drawing to a close in just 2 minutes. I'm going to extend it a tiny bit, but there was one very important question asked, which is the book already released? And the book is right here. It is released. This is a physical copy. I really recommend it to people. We don't always do the actual flogging the book in Quincy Book Talks, but I'm doing it right here. I think that were there different release dates for the UK and the US, or I actually ordered this copy from the UK, I think.
Yes, exactly. It's actually in UK, it's Penguins and Alan Lane, and it was released a week ago. So the book is available, but I think it's available on, for example, on the Amazon on the UK. So it's available in the UK, and the US, it's coming in March, Chicago University Press. So the publication date, I think, is 23rd of March, 2026. And last point, the title. Of course, the title is a copy of Polanyi's The Great Transformation. But I added the term of global, because it is indeed a book that deals with transformation of the world, economic transformation of the world, and to some extent also political, which was driven by these economic factors.
Yeah, and I ordered this book from the UK Amazon and they delivered it to my door, so you can actually do that. Okay, I'm going to just ask one final audience question that will take us, 2 minutes past the 1 o'clock, but I'm feeling guilt because I talked a lot. And this is a good one to end on, I think. Uh, and you described the past. You described the growth of inequality in the recent past and the reshaping of the global income distribution in the recent past. How do you see the reshaping of not just national economies, but the nature of global inequality over the next several decades?
Well, we didn't actually come to speak of that, and I now regret that I forgot to actually say much about this. But one of the themes of the book is that global income inequality, because of the rise of Asia and China in particular, has been on the decline over the last 25 years. And then you say, when you ask people, and actually when I had large conferences, I ask people, are you in favor of reduction of global income global income inequality? And everybody says yes. But if you break this and say, okay, well, that means that maybe your position globally would go down. Then people say, well, let me see, let me check about that. So we actually have a positive, very nice development of reduction of global income distribution, which does create many of these problems that we talked about domestically. So there are really two things which interact in a rather unexpected way, if you look at that very sort of superficially, but one positive development leads to a development that we kind of deplore. So that was a point about global income distribution. Now, how would it evolve in the future depends on what happens to Africa. China is no longer the engine of global income inequality reduction because it has become too rich for that. It essentially has gone over the median of the global income distribution, and faster growth of China makes China more different from countries like Sudan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and so forth, and then increases global inequality. So the 21st century, if you really think about desire to reduce inequality between citizens in the world, would depend on whether Africa can significantly increase its growth rates, because that's the only continent with increase in population, and it's a continent that has actually declined relative to the West and the rest of the world for the last 40 years, if not more. So that's the key question, is really Africa, and to some extent also maybe Pakistan or Bangladesh, but Africa is, I think, the key part.
Okay, well, Branko, this has been an amazing discussion. Really points to lots of further things we could think about, but we're already about 5 minutes over the hour. So I want to thank everybody and thank Branko especially, and encourage folks. Here, I'm flogging the book one more time, and encourage folks to get the book. Yes, thanks to everyone for participating.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really a pleasure. And this 1 hour passed very quickly, at least for me, passed very quickly.